I can't stop thinking about SCP. So much so that I couldn't write another video for this week. I am only compelled by SCP, and I'm not sure when I'll stop talking about it. So I've decided to talk about some SCP groups present throughout the articles. There are so many. I'm sure I won't talk about all of them, but these are the ones that come to mind. First off, the Scp Foundation. In SCP, there are various anomalies, and the main stories revolve around the Foundation, who go around and secure, contain, and protect various abnormal things. On the flip side is the Chaos Insurgency. Some agents of SCP wanted to use anomalies for more than just containing them. They wanted to make money with them, or accomplish specific goals that are mysterious. So the Chaos Insurgency was made. It's basically the evil version of SCP, but sometimes they're portrayed as not evil. I think they're a very interesting group in the lore of SCP. Then we move on to some cults. My favorite of all the cults are the Davites. The idea of the Davites is that there's a book that's an SCP, and any ink put on the book writes more of their civilization's history and changes reality. So they may not have ever existed. They may only be from this book. But each time this book is activated, a whole new history is written where they exist. Time has been changed and they now exist there. As a result, they have children, and those children now exist to further the Davites. It's fascinating. It's a really cool idea that really helps with the SCP lore, because if you can just make up histories of Davites, then you can do whatever you want with them, and it doesn't interfere with other historical things. I really like them. The Sarkic Cults. So there's a thing in SCP called Sarkicism, which is basically a religion based around sacrificing blood and flesh to this ancient god. And their goal is to cover the entire world with fleshy, horrible monster beings. And it's basically Cronenberg horror. It's like The Thing on crack. The idea is that they're these insane cultists that perform various rituals and create horrible monsters, and they've existed for thousands of years. Their main enemy is the Church of the Broken God, who also used to be called Mechanites. Basically what they are is they believe in a different god that's against that god, and they believe that technology is the answer, while the Sarkites believe technology is bad. The two are always fighting one another, and it's really fascinating to have these sort of two opposing enemies. Then you have more of the tech-based groups, which I really like. There's Dr. Wondertainment, which makes anomalies and sells them in a very flamboyant and exciting way. They're more like a toy company, and they make anomalies as toys, but they're incredibly dangerous. Then you have the Factory, which is the opposite side of that coin. They create anomalies and use them to make money, but they're less toy-based and more dangerous, way more dangerous. While Dr. Wondertainment is about creating joy and wonder in the universe by creating anomalous things, the Factory is about industrialization, about turning everyone into consumer and producer. And they use a lot of bad labor problems, and their factories are usually found and are horrifying in the way that they treat people, which is really interesting overall. Then you got Marshall Carter and Dark. They're sort of like the salesmen of anomalies. They buy and sell anomalies and create new ones and spread them across various organizations and just make money selling these things. Marshall and Carter are okay, but Dark is specifically the leader and the most cruel and fucked up one of them all. He's more like a mobster than a salesman. The other two are kind of like sleazy salesmen. And then last of all these tech-based things are Anderson Robotics, which are the crazy scientist version of all these. They build anomalies to make money to build better anomalies, but they go too far in their scientific practices. It's all about creating anomalies with technology. There's some more magical groups that I really like. There's Syncope Labs, which is a very mysterious group that is only in a couple of stories. And the idea about them is that in 1976, around then, they experimented on various school campuses and college campuses to sort of using musical and memory-based SCPs. So they use these anomalies to manipulate the students and to change them, and there's a lot of crazy mind-warping stuff about it. And I really like them as a concept, that we don't really know what they want. They're trying to create the harmony and fight something. We're not sure if they're good or evil, but we do know they're experimenting on innocent kids, usually high schoolers and college students. Most of the stories are actually set now and are referencing those past times when the experiments were caused, and now the consequences of those experiments are going on. Then you have the Serpent's Hand. They're like evil wizards, basically. There's an idea that there's this place called the Wanderer's Library, which holds all information and magic from around the universe, and the Serpent's Hand use it. They're pretty interesting. There's a lot of magic-based stuff. I don't know them all that well. I've only just started listening and watching and reading SCP stuff. I also just heard about Herman Fuller's Circus of the Disquieting, and it's really weird, and I don't know if I like it all that much. It's basically an evil carnival/circus that has a lot of anomaly things going on. My favorite of all those sort of groups is Periwatch. They're a lot smaller than most other groups. They're basically the idea that all like the Bigfoot hunters and all the Redditors and the people who are looking for conspiracy theories and like magic stuff and like monsters, they're sort of a combination of all of those into like a group called Periwatch. It's an organized group of all those people, and sometimes they stumble across anomalies and usually get killed, and it's more horror movie style than actually talking about SCPs. You don't learn a lot in them, and I think it's really interesting. It's sort of the creepypastas of SCP. But there's a bunch of different groups, and I'm really fascinated by all of them. There's the more ethereal ones, like the Global Occult Coalition and the Pattern Screamers, which are more thought-based. They're sort of ethereal and ghostly, and it's kind of hard to understand them. But there's a lot of groups in SCP, and having been listening to it and watching it and reading it, I'm really fascinated by these groups and very inspired. SCP has a way of making you more and more inspired the more you listen to it, and it's really hard to pull away from once you're diving in. I was going to go through an entire list of all my favorite SCPs, and maybe I'll save that for another video, but SCP has grabbed me, and it's hard to pull away. And I know that this probably isn't as interesting as just talking about random video games, but I really like the SCP stories, and I think you should check them out. Some really crazy ones. Personally, if I was going to name just a couple of ones I really like a lot of the Lord Blackwood stories are pretty cool if you want like a 1800s, like Victorian London kind of story. I've only read a few, but I really like them. My favorite character in all of SCP, at least so far, is the Reluctant Dimension Hopper. He's just a guy that just randomly teleports between dimensions, and is really fun, and they show up in a lot of stories, and I kind of relate to them a lot. Probably my favorite of all the scary ones would be the Yule Man, which is like emaciated murder Santa, and it's maybe the most horrific stuff I've heard of all the horror SCP stuff. Out of all the council, like the main characters sort of SCP, I really like Dr. Bright. The idea of like a lich failed and then he picked up the necklace and suddenly he's immortal and he could swap bodies is really interesting. And then out of all the classic ones, I really like the Old Man, especially the tales about him. The Old Man is one of the classic monsters from the original 1000 SCPs. But yeah, I don't want to go on for too long talking about this. But there are a lot of stories I'd love to talk about. I don't think I'm going to be an SCP YouTuber, but I just really like these stories right now, and they're kind of taking up my headspace, and I make videos about stuff I'm excited about in the moment, sort of like a time capsule of what I'm currently doing and excited about, and I can't stop reading these, so until I find something else to talk about, I might do a couple more of these. Anyway, if you like this video, do all the usual YouTube stuff. Please like, comment, subscribe. I'd really like to actually have a real audience and not just a couple of people who randomly find me. But I'm going to keep making these for a while. And as always, thanks for listening. Bye.